This topic I've written about and spoken about, and it's not just about who's managing the money, but also who's overseeing it. So it's highly relevant to trustees and directors also. This question about what type of people, by type, I'm going to talk most about things like temperament, personality, character. Those to me are the important things, and we tend not to focus on them. And we tend not to focus on them because they're very hard to define and they're even harder to measure. And unfortunately, we've fallen in the trap that Drucker warned us about. Peter Drucker is the only management consultant worth reading. He's the one who said what gets measured gets managed. But being Peter Drucker, he knew the downside of that, and he warned us of it, and it's been ignored, that probably implies that what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed, and the important things in life are not measurable, and therefore they don't get managed. And we see that over and over and over again. And the important things to me are character, temperament, personality, those sorts of things. So if I can click on it. Oh, right. So let me give you an instance. Here are two people you know well, Volcker and Greenspan. Effective making decisions. It's really about decision making, not about outcomes, because outcomes we know nothing about. The only thing we can control is decision making. There's a lot of research in decision making that shows that the temperament of people involved is important. So here are two extremes, and the pictures tell the character. Pretty much spot on. Volcker, like this, bugger you, I'll do what's right. That was his character. It still is his character, and he's incredibly important. He gets rolled by Wall Street, of course, but he speaks his mind, and he speaks the truth to power. And he was a very effective head of the Fed. Greenspan was not an effective head of the Fed, and Greenspan suffered at a personality level from that picture. He craved to be loved. And he craved to be loved by a dumb war criminal. That makes it even more surprising that he would do that. When he followed after Schiller warned of the irrational exuberance in the market, and he did speak about that, and all hell broke loose and he backed off and he never mentioned it again. He had an opportunity to prick the very tiny tech bubble in 1999 and he missed it, and what we've suffered from since has been a result of that. But if you look at temperament and character in politics, Churchill had a wonderful temperament for war and an absolutely lousy temperament for everything else. He was a failure in everything else. But when it came to war, because that's the way he understood the world, he was superb. Roosevelt was said about Roosevelt that he had a second-class mind and a first-class temperament, and that was not an insult. And it's pretty true. And if you look at some of our politicians, Obama, by the way, has the wrong temperament right now for the circumstances he's in. He's a consensus guy, he's reasonable, he's rational, and he's dealing with totally irrational people on the other side. And that temperament will therefore get beaten the way Chamberlain's temperament was beaten by Hitler. If you look at somebody like Turnbull, probably the most intelligent guy in Parliament, but has the temperament of a banker and a broker, and politics about drilling a hole through a hard bit of wood with a blunt instrument, and he doesn't have the temperament for that. Rudd had the wrong temperament, clearly the wrong temperament. Gillard was a great negotiator and a lousy leader. Why do we select them on the basis of what they've done in the past? The temperament, and that's true in investing too. And let me just show you a few people who will say similar things. There's Buffett. Buffett, in his wisdom, says high IQ and investment success are not well correlated. That's certainly been my experience. In fact, if anything that's too high, it's usually the other way around. He has a trade for you, and his trade is if you've got an IQ of 140, you give him 20 of your IQ points, he'll give you a better temperament. Temperament is what it is about. And when you see people like that saying it, and his teacher Ben Graham, there's Ben Graham, some earlier, before, saying the same sort of thing. Character and temperament are the important things. You obviously need some degree of intelligence, probably a reasonable level, but you don't need to be super intelligent. And one of the things that you really need, as Graham was talking about, is independence. And independence is sadly lacking. We are an industry that is incredibly uniform. Every visitor to our shore says the same thing. All the funds are the same, all the people are the same, they all do the same thing. That's got a systemic risk in it. Because when the one thing goes wrong, it'll all go wrong. So there's a real systemic worry there that APRA should be concerned about. But have you not seen this? Is this not a common story in boards that you are familiar with, this sort of thing? And the Abilene paradox addresses that issue of lack of independence and lack of courage to speak out. So the Abilene paradox, there was an economist who was sitting at home on a very hot Texas day. His wife and 2 kids were bored, as was he, and he was quite happy sitting there, but he decided, for whatever reason, that they would like to go on a trip. So he suggested, why don't we get in a car and drive to Abilene, it's 60 miles away, get an ice cream and then drive back. The last thing that his wife or kids wanted to do was drive 120 miles for an ice cream on a hot Texas day. But they didn't say anything because they thought Dad wanted to do it. So all 4 of them got in the car, drove 120 miles there and back for an ice cream that none of them wanted to do. They got the worst possible result. They all did the suboptimal thing because no one stood up and said, I don't want to do it, and was independent. That's the Abilene paradox. And once you're aware of it, you see it everywhere. That's a lack of character, a lack of personality, or maybe it's being very sensitive in that case. Here is that lack of independence is evident in a very recent report that's come out by Mark Wiseman. I don't know the guy from McKinsey, but Mark Wiseman is the president and chair of the Canadian Pension Board, Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board, a $200 billion, very, very well run by all measures fund. And what they found when they looked at boards of corporations and of pension funds was exactly this damning comment that he makes, that independence is not valued highly. And it's not just, and it's independence of mind. That's why I favour trustees having their being 51% independent, but independent of mind. That's the critical thing, and we don't assess that because it's too scary. The right temperament and character that's Seth Klarman, an investment manager, wonderful value investment manager, saying right there and then that you have to have the right temperament to actually be a good value manager. If you want to be excited, if you want to find bargains, you shouldn't be a value manager. You're just not suited for it. On the other hand, if you like excitement and the latest thing, you should probably be a growth manager. And you see that when you look at bond managers. Bond managers tend to be rather depressive. The sky's always going to fall in, inflation's always just around the corner. Equity managers suffer the other way, everything's always going to grow to the sky. It's always a good time to buy equities, isn't it? If they're cheap, you've got to buy them, and if they're expensive, you've got to buy them because everyone else is. You know, that sort of nonsense comes from a lack of character, and we fall for it. Women, interestingly, there are some studies, and a growing number of studies, that show that women have a much better temperament for investing. Why? They're patient, they listen better in an engaged way, they are better at sharing and cooperating, they take risks, but their risks are much more considerate, they don't trade too much, they don't feel a need for activity. So one study by Terry Odian of a large number of brokerage accounts found that over 5 years, he was able to look at the women and the men. The women traded less, much less, and after 5 years, they were 3% per annum ahead. And yet, there is, on the large scale, there's only one woman CIO of a super fund. There are a couple at a smaller scale. There's something missing there, something wrong, and you can see the bias that's there. Temperament is just important for that. One of the key things that you need in investing is the right temperament. Here's Lucy Kellaway using a word she knows was the rhetorical flourish. No one is going to praise laziness, therefore it's a great headline. But she's really talking about we're too busy. Jeremy Grantham, who is a great investor, was my boss, had a saying, too much hard work gets in the way of thinking. And it does. And our job, particularly if you're a trustee, your job is to think strategically, not to do things. And that thinking is hard work. We know it is because not many people do it. And that's what this is about, doing more thinking. And that means doing nothing. But not doing nothing means thinking. And this cartoon captures the spirit of what I call thoughtful inertia. And there's truth in that. It does take a long time when to not do something. And I think that slogan, "Don't just do something, sit there," is the main thing that great investors stand out. Buffett says, "I do very little but sit on my arse." Of course, he wouldn't say arse, he'd say butt. Charlie Munger does the same. Jeremy Grantham does the same. Soros does the same. John Templeton used to do the same. These people sit and they think. They don't want to be active. That's a temperamental issue. And here is a survey, a recent survey by the CFA. The CFA asked its members this question about news, in inverted commas. It's not news, it's drivel. How important is it? And you can see almost 100% of people say it's crap. It's worth nothing. But do they watch it? Yeah. Do they follow it? Yeah. Do they turn on Twitter and iPads and so on and look for this sort of stuff? Yeah, they do. And is that dangerous? It is dangerous. It's exactly like McDonald's. McDonald's is dangerous, this is dangerous. It's exactly the same idea of fast food. And we've got to turn that off. Most of the stuff you receive is drivel, and you've got to recognise what's drivel. And there are a few sources that aren't drivel. The Economist, the FT, the Wall Street Journal, if you can get over the Murdoch press and the bias in it. And that's sort of about it. The rest of it you can ignore. It's not even worth reading. It's good to read a bit of gossip, but that's all. But don't pretend you're getting anything. When someone asks you, what did the market do today? The correct answer is, I neither know nor care. And that's the right answer to give, because it's noise. You know it's noise, we know it's noise. You want me to give an answer? I'll give you an answer. There were more buyers than sellers. That's always a good one. You don't like that one? All right, there was profit taking, a lot of profit taking going on. You know, that's the sort of garbage that people say. And it is crap. So why do we listen to it? I don't. I turn all that stuff on. I don't follow it at all. And I think and the good investors, that doesn't make me a good investor, but it's a necessary condition. It's not sufficient. So turn off the garbage. And the problem that lies in us is that we're human. Luckily, we are not Homo economicus. We do not fit the agenda of the University of Chicago that we're rational profit maximisers. We are not like that, and our organisations are not like that. We are, as Danny Kahneman says, we are not made for this world, and we certainly don't handle uncertainty well. And when it comes to short and long term, and the reason I've got the picture there, the book is really about how we think in two different ways. We have very short-term thinking driven by the limbic brain, the reptilian brain deep in there, the first brain we had, which is about flight and fright and fear. It controls our behaviour, and we know that with experiments done on bond traders. When you wire them up, the prefrontal cortex doesn't fire first, it's the limbic brain that fires first. The instinctive brain. And so we think very short term. The long-term thinking that is critical for what we're in takes time and patience and the right temperament. So his example, and if you've heard it before, forget it, but if you haven't, his example is a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. How much and the bat cost $1 more than the ball, how much does each cost? Now, if you haven't heard that before, I can almost guarantee that through your head ran the answer, the bat's $1 and the ball's 10 cents, and that's the wrong answer, because that would make the difference 90 cents, not $1. The right answer is 5 cents for the ball and $1.05 for the bat. Short-term, very quick thinking gives us a convenient answer. It's a convenient answer, we latch onto it. There's a bias, there's a heuristic there that we do. To avoid it, we have to put in deep thought to get to the $1.05, and we avoid it. And that's what Danny Kahneman's book is about how you can do something to avoid it. And it's not, long-term thinking is not easy because you've got to worry about the short-term too. And this captures it. You can't totally ignore the short-term. The real skill with great investors is knowing when, and very rarely, to act on the short-term. That's the skill that Buffett's got. And that's a temperamental issue. And when I see headlines like that, there's something wrong. If you can't deal with uncertainty, if you can't handle uncertainty, if you can't thrive under uncertainty, you've got the wrong temperament for the business. So it shouldn't dog the institutions. Uncertainty is intrinsic to capital markets. That's why you can get paid for them. And I can't actually... Oh, and then because we're not homo economists, and the usual model from the University of Chicago is that we have become obsessed with process. So here are two comments by two great thinkers, Peter Bernstein, a great investor, warning you, don't think because you've measured something you've understood it. The real problem lies with the uncertainty. And John Kay, who ran a program for the UK government into the nature of the UK equity market, of the many things he found was this rather horrific thing that he found from managers and pension fund executives in the same extent. It wasn't whether the process or what they had was any good, it was whether they could articulate a process. That was all that mattered. That's a horrific comment. They have forgotten what they're really there for. And that's temperament to bring that back to something. And part of the way of doing that is to reject the University of Chicago model, which after the crisis we should reject. We're not rational. We can't be rational. What we can be is boundedly rational. And here was one of the great decision-making thinkers of the world, Herbert Simon, who got the Nobel Prize in 1959. And he's saying we're not rational, and we can't be rational. We're at best boundedly rational. We have to institutionalise that idea, and that means we don't spend that much time on process and measuring because it doesn't achieve much. And what he's saying there is we're boundedly rational. There are limits to the way we can think. There's limits to cognition, there's limits to causality, there's limits to how much we can know. We are boundedly rational. We try to be rational. But then, because of that, we don't optimise. This whole industry is obsessed by optimising. And as Herbert Simon pointed out, we can't really do that. We satisfice. It's an old Scottish word, a combination of satisfaction and sufficiency. And the example he gives in his Nobel Prize-winning speech was you have a tear in your pants, you've got a patch that you can sew on. If you had a B4 needle, you could sew it on and you would do it quickly, efficiently, and it would be invisible. But as he says, the essence of a needle is to be buried in a haystack. And the B4 needle is so buried in a haystack. But you've got an A6 needle, and the A6 needle is clunky and it's thick, and if you sew the patch on, it'll take you longer and it won't be invisible. You'll see it, but it'll get the job done. That is satisficing. The first one's optimising, the second one's satisficing. That's what we do in investing. And we should stop trying to pretend that we're optimising, because it's a myth. So what sort of people should we have? Well, here's a wish list of the sort of people that I think, when I look around and I see the sort of temperament that we should admire and aim for. And that's so far away I can't read it. Thrive under uncertainty. Not avoid uncertainty, thrive under it, but yet be able to make decisions. So many people might like uncertainty, but they continue wanting to debate. You've got to make decisions under uncertainty. That's a tough call. Certainly risk seekers. When I was a CIO, I used to ask managers, are you taking enough risk? Not are you taking too much, are you taking enough? Our business is taking risk. So it's got to be, and most managers are scared to take risk because when they go wrong, you know what the consequences are. That's bad temperament and bad structure. Speak the truth to power. Of course, as Noam Chomsky said, power knows the truth. They hide it from you, but they know the truth, but you still have to speak it to them. Independently, handle dissent. We don't handle dissent well at all. We are terrible at handling dissent. So you're sitting in a meeting and there's a sort of broad agreement on something and there's one guy who disagrees. How do we handle it? We say, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and you move on. It's something that we are obviously not very skilled or trained to do well. There are a few who can do it well, but it's very rare. The knowing thyself, which is the Oracle of Delphi's advice to anyone, to know thyself, to know your own biases and your own prejudices and your own temperament is a critical thing investing, because if you don't know that, you're vulnerable to somebody coming along and selling you, a spruiker selling you something. And the spruikers know how to deal with that. That's a pretty important thing. And a sense of history. Sense of history is important, not just economic history, broad history. Engaged listeners, Larry Summers, who may have become the president of the Fed and luckily didn't. Larry Summers, probably the smartest guy around in macroeconomics, youngest professor of economics at Harvard ever. this Treasury Secretary, President of Harvard, you name it, he's got it. But his problem is, as Obama said, he thinks with his mouth open. He doesn't listen, and he never did. And as a chairman of a Fed, where you've got different branches with different views, you have to be able to listen properly, and he couldn't. He is the sort of guy, everyone says, who is the smartest guy in the room, but he has to show you he's the smartest guy in the room. And I think his drawback goes back to the fact that he's got two uncles, both of whom won Nobel Prizes in economics. And that probably explains some of his personal inadequacies. They're temperamental problems. And I think Obama was right not to appoint him to the head of the Fed. A responsibility beyond self, that's the agency problem. Beyond self and your appointing bodies. It's the biggest, to me, the biggest cost in this industry, not direct cost, but indirect cost of people doing things not because they're the right things to do, but because of loyalty to whoever appointed you or loyalty to other people. That, to me, is the definition of professionalism, somebody who does things beyond self. It's embedded in the Hippocratic Oath. It's even embedded, actually, in the accountants' rules. The first statement is your job as an accountant is to preserve the integrity of the system. It's not even about clients. It's the integrity of the system. Whether they do, it's another story. And then finally, behave ethically under pressure. That's the real test. It's easy to be ethical when there's no pressure, but that's another test. These are the sorts of things I think we should be looking at when we make appointments. And what do we do? By and large, people in this industry, certainly in the investment management industry, if you look at the Myers-Briggs classification, we're all pretty much the same. We're accountants, actuaries, economists, mathematicians, physicists, and we think in the same way. And that's pretty dangerous. So broaden the scope. Jim Chanos, I'll just finish. Jim Chanos, one of the great short equity managers in the world, has always said publicly that the best analyst he ever had was a woman who had a degree in his 12th century Islamic art. And he hired her with no knowledge of finance and investing, precisely because she had no knowledge of finance and investing. And therefore, she was able to challenge everything he did. That's the sort of thing we should do.